Well, thank you. We have a lot of information to cover in a relatively short amount of time. I usually take an hour or so to cover this, but we'll try to get through it without too much delay. First of all, we're going to be looking at biomimetics today. Biomimetics simply means biomimicry, bio in the Greek referring to life. And so it's copying designs seen in the world of biology, trying to adapt them for our own technology, and finding out, as they have, that many of the things we thought we invented, we really didn't. They were there from the beginning. Some other intelligent being thought of it first, and everything we find in life, from the tiniest cell to great blue whales to human beings, is far more complex than any machine man has ever made. So he's not only the first one to think of these designs, he made them more complex and more efficient and better than anything that we have today. So biomimetics means really that God invented it first. Now, God invented DNA, something Darwin knew nothing about, but it's so complex it could not evolve even if we had trillions times trillions of years and trillions of universes to work with. For example, just to get all the right configured right-handed deoxyribose sugars, 1 chance in 10 to the power of 300. To get all the correct bonds by chance, 1 chance in 10 to the power of 300 again. To exclude non-biological compounds in the alleged primitive ocean, 1 chance conservatively 10 to the power of 1,000. You multiply these together, the structural specificity, 1 chance in 10 to the power of 1,600. Now, for comparison, the estimated number of atoms in the entire known universe is only about 10 to the 80th power. So this is utterly beyond the capability of chance. Even if you had trillions of years, it gets worse. You also have to have the code. The nucleotide alphabet letters, adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine, have to be in the right order. That's 4 to the 1,000th power converted to 10. Base 10 is 10 to the power of 600. So a whopping 1 chance in 10 to the power of 2,200. That is the number 1 with 2,200 zeros after it. Now, is that a big number? Yes. How do we know? Well, it's bigger than the national debt accumulated under Obama, so it's got to be big. But it's, again, inconceivable. Trillions and trillions of years, trillions of universes worth of atoms randomly mixing together could not do this. But it can be done by intelligent design. Now then, we have to get both DNA, the first cell, and all the information to convert, say, an amoeba to a man. That requires that you add information to it. Mutation means change, but in the evolutionary sense, random change, never intelligent change. So it's accidental. It's like a typographical error. So does anybody recognize this sentence, used as a drill in typing practice? Contains all 26 letters of the English language. The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dogs. Let's put some random mistakes and see if it gets better. We get the Dwick brown Aox jumped over the lost Eogs. Well, maybe 6 random mistakes will do the trick. We get the Dwick brazen Aox triumphed over the lost Eogs. It sounds a little Swedish, perhaps, but I'll guarantee you there's no Swede that can read that. That's what happens to information. If you randomly mutate it, it degenerates into gibberish, and that's why mutations are almost always deleterious, and the odds of them working again are infinitesimal beyond all space and time. So the problem is when you damage something, any complex thing, it doesn't get better, it gets worse and worse until it doesn't work. Even Theodosius Dobzhansky, the most evident evolutionist of the 20th century, he recognized that this appeared to be a contradiction with their mechanism, but they never have resolved that contradiction. The natural selection deception says, well, natural selection selects better information and gets rid of the bad information. The catch is random processes can't produce any better information, so there's no better information to select. You see, it's not the natural creator, it's the natural selector. And if it's always getting worse information, it can't select any better. You know, a child could figure that out. It's not rocket science. Anyway, so natural selection has no power to create new and better biological information. Rather, it is wholly at the mercy of random destructive mutations to provide the necessary new information. Since random mutations cannot produce the needed results, natural selection is left helpless with nothing better to select. So they have no credible mechanism at all. Now let's look at some of the amazing designs that man, many of which man thought he invented first, but actually God did first. Man thought that he had invented sign language, but God gave that ability to the amazing bees. A scout bee comes out, locates a source of food, does this particular dance on the honeycomb, and it communicates to the other bees where the honey is, or where the nectar is. And it's done in relation to position of the hive to the sun. All the other bees know this innately. It waggles on the angle from this vertical line. Whatever angle shows what angle to go. The vibration shows how good the food source is. The duration in seconds determines the distance to the food source. And it computes to about 1 kilometer per second of dance, or about 0.62 miles per second. So information, sign language, God put it there first. And we know that birds have been able to migrate transoceanic, transcontinental for thousands of years. They use the equivalent of devices that we invented for navigation, but God already put them in their little bird brains. And ultimately, it's in the bird eggs, because we have proof that these creatures can, being abandoned by their parents, fly the same amazing routes over never before seen land and sea and join their parents thousands of miles away. The parents weren't there to guide them. It's in the DNA of the egg. Some master navigator put it in there for them. But it's really amazing that something as small as a monarch with a pinhead-sized brain has the same capabilities. They migrate over the North Atlantic Ocean, hitting islands they've never seen before in their life, migrating down to Guatemala, ultimately, zigzagging, knowing islands are there, hitting them with precision. It takes true navigation capability to do that. They orient to the sun to determine direction, regardless of time of day. They have slits in their antenna that act like a sextant to measure the distance of the sun above the horizon. They have a built-in calendar and pre-digested navigator's almanac in their little pinhead-sized brain. So these astronomical computations will tell you where you are as far as latitude. But you also have to determine longitude, and that requires accurate clocks that compare the local time with the time at zero longitude or the standard meridian. So you subtract to find the difference in minutes, then you take that number and divide by a certain number to determine your longitude. Anybody know what number you divide by? Well, you're all going to be lost at sea trying to find an island you've never been at before. You'll drown, but the monarchs have it built into their pinhead-sized brain. So next time somebody calls you a pinhead, say thank you. That's actually not so bad. Okay, now then, if it's cloudy or foggy, they have a magnetic compass they can use to orient to the Earth's magnetic field. But all of this is useless unless you have something else too. What's that? A map. You have to have an accurate map, because a map tells you there's actually islands out there. You've never seen that ocean before. You've never gone to those islands before. What do you do when you're going someplace you've never gone before? You check a map, trusting that whoever made the map actually knows what they're doing and knows the knowledge, because if they tell you the island is in the wrong place, you compute longitude and latitude, you go there and there's no island and you drown. So all of this doesn't work unless it all works together. It's called irreducible complexity. It did not happen by blind random destructive mutations. Now, shock absorbers help with cars, but sometimes you have delicate electronics that have extreme shock force and G-force that need to be protected. Somebody asked the biomimicker question, has this problem been addressed in the world of biology? And yes, it has. In the remarkable woodpecker, which we now have measured, can endure up to 1,200 Gs of force, hundreds of times a minute at the speed of a submachine gun. If we are subjected to 100 degrees or 100 Gs of force, 100 times the force of gravity, it'll kill any human. But this does 1,200 Gs and apparently doesn't get a headache. So that's pretty good engineering. So they said, let's identify, and they found 4 different features of the woodpecker's skull and brain case that they tried to emulate with this package, and they found it worked very well. But the inspiration came from the design that God put in the woodpecker. Now, of course, the Wright brothers, both of whom were Christians and had a Christian minister father, they believed that God was the first aeronautical engineer. And so they studied to make their first Wright flyer birds, studied the aerofoil design of their wings, and came up with a working flyer. Of course, they weren't the first. God created flying creatures, both birds and mammals, and also insects, and even flying reptiles, 4 different classes. God invented it first. It took man a little bit longer to invent hovering aircraft, but God beat them to the punch again, didn't he, with the magnificent hummingbird, which puts any helicopter to shame. When you look at the maneuverability of a hummingbird and even insects, the 4-winged dragonfly can put any helicopter to shame with its amazing maneuverability. Man invented the gliding craft before powered craft, and even the Wright brothers used a glider first to test the aerodynamic principles of their later Wright Flyer powered vehicle. But God beat us to the punch there too. He made the so-called flying fish, which is really a glider, and of course the flying squirrel. And parachutists use that design today. They wear a suit called the flying squirrel suit, and helps them glide a long distance before they deploy their parachutes. George de Maistre, he is a Swiss electronics engineer, but he has invented something probably all of you have used one time or another in your life, but it's not an electronic device. He went out walking with his dog, and he'd always get burrs stuck in his clothing. He thought, why do those burrs stick so good? Being of a scientific mind, he thought he'd look at it under a microscope. He saw they had all these nifty little hooks at the end, and that gave him an idea. What if we used hooks like that and had another strip with loops, and we could produce something very practical? It's called Velcro. But the inspiration came from what he saw that God had created first. Here we have an artificial fishing lure, which is designed to look rather like a fish and colored like a fish, and has a little device on it that makes it wiggle in the water when you're trolling to look like it's swimming like a fish. And although it's artificial, it looks enough that many fish will bite on it thinking they're getting a meal, but actually they become the meal. But even an artificial lure is not something man thought of first and invented. God invented it first with the appropriately named anglerfish. The anglerfish has a movable wand on his back, and at the end he has bioluminescent cells. Using a biological oxidative process, it produces very efficient cold light, very little of the efficiency lost in heat. And usually it lives so deep down in the water that the sunlight can't penetrate. It's like totally dark. So the fish see this, which looks like a little worm dangling right in front of his mouth. They come down to get that worm, and they go right in the mouth of the anglerfish. God invented artificial lures first. Now then, we think that, we've been really smart learning how to convert solar energy into electrical energy, but the concept of converting solar energy into a more useful form of energy, in our case electricity for our technology, but for the plant and animal kingdom, you need to convert it into chemical energy. And that's known as the amazing process of photosynthesis. The first solar cells were leaves on plants. God created it first on day 3 at the beginning of creation. So it uses a very complex Calvin cycle and photosynthetic reaction to produce solar energy and convert it into chemical energy that then can be used both by plants and animals. It powers most of the living world indirectly through converted solar energy. God thought of it first. And the chloroplasts that he used are so complex that we could not go into a laboratory, start from scratch with the basic chemical components and put one together. Even in the 21st century, it's beyond our technology. So he not only did it first, he did it better than we can do it, even in the 21st century. Now, man struggled with making good quality glass and mirrors for centuries. Paul said a couple thousand years ago, we see us through a glass darkly, because although they knew how to make glass in the days of the Roman Empire, they hadn't figured out the correct chemical recipe to make it clear. That took until about the Renaissance time, and then it took a little bit longer to make it, good quality without aberrations in it and everything. But by the late Renaissance, at the time of Sir Isaac Newton, they had good enough quality glass and mirrors that he decided to use, for the first time, a mirror as a telescope. It's called the reflector telescope. It actually bears his name to this day, the Newtonian telescope. But long before man had finally perfected optical quality mirrors, God had done it from the very beginning. It's found in the eyes of shrimp and lobsters and a particular fish, a fish called the spookfish. I don't know if he's called the spookfish because he looks spooky, because he has 4 eyes instead of 2, or because he spooks so easily because you can't sneak up on him, because he sees both up and down at the same time with these 4 eyes. So we have a cross-section here where we can see one eye is conventional eye with a lens that refracts the incoming light and focuses the image on a retina here. But he has a second eye next to it, and images coming from beneath him are reflected off this optical quality concave mirror and focused on a retina there. So it has 4 eyes, 4 retinas, 4 optic nerves that all go to the same single brain and processes all that information. So that kind of processing we didn't even have any inkling of until the late 20th century, but it was always there in the world of biology. God created mirrors first. Now, in World War II, sonar came into his own and was key in winning the Battle of the North Atlantic against the German U-boats. It's based on the principle of echolocation. You send out sound waves that hit a target, and the reverberating sound waves are then analyzed to determine depth, bearing, or direction, and speed. And against big targets like that, it worked pretty good even in World War II. But God had much finer and more capable sonar from the very beginning. For example, with the bats. The bats can take off in a totally dark cave, millions of them flying out. They don't run into each other, even though it's totally dark, because they see by sound, by echolocation. And when they get out in the night, a moonless night, they go after little gnats that are no-see-ums. They can't hardly see during broad daylight, but they can see with sound so precisely, more than our sonar, and catch them in their mouth. We only wish we could make sonar that was that technically advanced. God also gave that ability to this marine mammal, the dolphin. The dolphin has strong muscles in its nasal sacs that contract and produce a powerful clicking sound. That's actually focused through a sound lens made of lipidic tissue or fatty tissue, and it actually focuses that sound almost like a beam of light, like a searchlight that it looks with to locate schools of fish and individual fish. The sound reverberates off the target and is picked up by the special fatty tissue in its lower jaw, goes right to the ear and to the brain for processing. Navy tests have shown that it's so good They can train dolphins even during muddy water conditions where you really can't see. It's like a fog. They'll throw in nickels and dimes. The dolphins have been trained to go after the dimes and ignore the nickels. They can tell the difference by sound. Still more sophisticated than what we have, and God invented it first. Now here we have a paddle wheel boat. Paddle wheel boats are only used for nostalgic cruises. They aren't used to ship cargo because they're not that efficient. Back in the late 1800s, a man invented a far more efficient means of propulsion, the screw propeller, much more efficient than the paddle wheel. So this rotary propulsion system beats everything. That's why it's used today. And man thought he invented that in the late 1800s, but it had been there from the beginning of creation. God was the first one to invent true rotary propulsion. It exists on the world's tiniest submarine, but the submarine is not listed in the Guinness Book of World Records because it's not a product of human manufacture. God made it. It is the Escherichia coli or E. coli bacterium, and it has a true rotary motor, much like an electric rotary motor, but it works on a different principle. You use electromotive force, the flow of negatively charged electrons in an electric motor. This has a positronic force. It uses the flow of positive charged particles, hydrogen ions or protons, and they spin through this thing. It has 40 different protein parts. Proteins, like DNA, are incredibly complex and specific and could not have evolved with trillions of years of time. And you have 40 of them. If just one protein is missing, the whole thing is inoperative. It's just like your car. You might have all the parts in the internal combustion engine working, but if one part doesn't work, say your fuel pump doesn't work, it doesn't matter all the other parts work, you're not going anywhere. Maybe the distributor cap is damaged or missing. Doesn't matter you have all the other parts. It all works together or you're not going anywhere. Same thing. This has to be perfect. All the parts there, and you can't even get one part because every protein is too complex to evolve. But this has been called by Howard Berg of Harvard the most efficient engine known to exist in the universe. It operates at nearly 100% efficiency. By comparison, in our automobiles, if it's a V8 or something, you might get 15 or 20% efficiency out of that engine. A good economy car, you might get up to 40%. A hybrid, you do better. The best are electrical engines. They might get 65 to 70%. Tesla, the famous electric car manufacturer, recently said their engineers have made a breakthrough. Their new engine had 75% efficiency. Well, this thing is 99.5 plus. Almost 100%. We have nothing that can approach that level of efficiency. It's also incredibly powerful. This can spin at up to 100,000 RPM, and it twists this filament like a propeller, and it can go as much as 65 body lengths per second. When things are very tiny, you don't measure their velocity in miles per hour, but how many of their own body lengths they can go through in 1 second of time. Now, to put that in perspective, we can understand. Say we take this little bacterium and we enlarge its size until it's as big and long as a 20-foot long mini submarine with electric engines. If that mini submarine, 20 feet long, went 65 of its own lengths in 1 second, how many feet would it go? 1,300 feet. What's the speed of sound at sea level? Approximately 1,125 feet per second. It would be going faster than Mach 1 underwater. The water is nearly 800 times denser than the atmosphere. So our Mach 1, Mach 2 jets, they fly through something much thinner than water. This not only goes through water, when you're that tiny, the water molecules proportionately are much bigger and harder to push aside. So it'd be more the equivalent of having a 20-foot mini submarine that could go over Mach 1, not just underwater, but through something as thick as peanut butter and attain those speeds. We have nothing in our technology with power like that. It also can be spinning 100,000 RPM, and it smells food behind it. Without slowing down, it immediately shifts in reverse and backs up 100,000 RPM. Can you imagine doing that on the freeway? Oh, I missed the exit. I don't need to slow down. I'll just shift it in reverse. Ooh, you'll destroy your engine, your transmission. But this thing is incredibly resilient. So it's incredibly powerful, incredibly efficient, incredibly resilient. We have nothing that can match its capabilities. But the scientists say after decades of studying it, they only know one thing for sure. Blind random destructive mutations created the thing. We can't even duplicate it in the 21st century with our intelligence, for crying out loud. How did blind random forces do it? It makes no sense at all. So the first true rotary propulsion system and the true first submarine in that regard, God invented first. Here we have the Apache longbow helicopter. It has infrared targeting devices that allows it to see in the non-visible spectrum, the infrared or heat spectrum at night. So the terrorists glow at night, which I'm sure they don't like because they get targeted by the Apache. But this was not something man invented in the late 20th century. God invented infrared targeting pods first, called FLIR, forward-looking infrared, and he gave it to all things snakes. Here we have the FLIR devices, forward-looking infrared targeting pods on a python and here on a rattlesnake. Now these are so effective that when they tape over the eyes of the snake so it's totally blind, they'll poke at it with a stick to kind of get its attention, and it can tell the difference between the heat signature of the stick and the heat signature of the background effectively enough that it'll strike and hit that stick every time, being totally blind. Just like the Apache, it can see in the dark, but God invented it first. Here we have decoy ducks. They're pretty simple technology. You make something that looks like a duck, put it in the water, ducks flying over, think, well, those ducks are having a good time. There must be food down there. It doesn't look like they're being harassed by hunters. Well, we'll come down and join them, which is what it's meant to do. A decoy is to bring in creatures close that normally would not come in close. But this idea is not new. God invented it first. He invented a little freshwater clam that makes its own decoy. And if it didn't, it wouldn't be able to reproduce and survive. This little freshwater clam mounts on its back what looks for all the world like a little minnow, little fish with an eye and a body and fins and a tail, and it even moves like it's trying to swim against the current, just like fish will lazily, swim just to keep their own against the current without being flushed downstream. So, what does this animated decoy look like? Well, there it is. It looks for all the world like a fish, and it even moves like a fish. Now, why does a clam need to put such an exquisite animated decoy on its back? Because if it doesn't, it can't reproduce. See, fish normally ignore clams. They have that hard shell. They can't eat them. They're as bad as a rock. They pay them no attention. But this clam has to get the fish to pay it attention and come in close. Because the fish has to come in close, somehow it recognizes the orientation of the fish, we think by some kind of electric field of some kind, and it knows the orientation of the fish. When the fish gets in the right place, it squirts its larvae right into the mouth of the fish. These microscopic larvae have little hooks on them that attach to the gills of the fish and extract nutrients from the bloodstream, till they're grown into tiny little clams that then fall off on the bottom and grow to adult clams and mount their own animated decoys so that they can reproduce. Yeah, God invented it first, but this is so exquisite, why would evolution even try to do such a thing? And how long would it take? By evolutionary standards, for something that exquisite to evolve would take perhaps at least tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. How in the world do you reproduce in the meantime? Good question. God is not just the great engineer, he is also the great artist. Now here we have the inlet spikes on the jet engine intakes of a couple of modern jets. And that's to keep too much air from coming in. Too much can be a good thing. It can be overwhelming and cause the engine to flame out. But this is not an aerodynamic engineering design that man thought of first and invented in the 20th century. God invented it first for his fastest flying aerial vehicle that he created, the Peregrine Falcon. Recently, National Geographic clocked them diving at about 254 miles per hour, faster than any Indianapolis 500 race car. And you get too much air in your nostrils, it can cause a lot of trouble. But God gave them first the inlet spike to keep too much air at high speed from getting into their nostrils. God invented it first. Now here we have a MiG-15 dogfighting with a MiG-29 Fulcrum. Dogfights don't happen hardly at all anymore because we have missiles that can engage enemy aircraft at beyond visible range by radar. But there is a scenario where you still get in a dogfight. Both sides run out of missiles. Then what do? You have to fall back on older technology, a gun. In the white wing root of the F-15 Eagle, there is a gun that was invented in the 1800s that's so good it's still used in the 21st century. Anybody know the name of the inventor? His name was Dr. Gatlin. It's a Gatlin cannon with 6 barrels, and the old Gatlin cannons, you had to hand crank. You'd be lucky to get 6 or 7 rounds per second. They put a powerful electrical engine on this that spins it so fast it shoots the equivalent of 6,000 rounds per minute, which computes to 100 rounds per second. APHEI, armor-piercing, high-explosive incendiary rounds. That means if your opponent comes to your crosshairs while you're firing for just 1/10 of 1 second, it still gets hit by 10 high-explosive cannon rounds, which will take down any aircraft. So when they do get in these up-close dogfights, they do radical maneuvers. You don't want to be targeted even for a split second, or you're done for. But the problem is, the weakest link in any dogfight is the pilot. The airframe of modern aircraft can endure a lot more G-forces than the pilot can. 9 or 10 Gs, the blood drains out of your head, you pass out and crash or get shot down. So from the days of World War II, when G-lock, the problem of blood being pulled out of your head by G-forces, made pilots pass out, they invented the inflatable G-suit. where you have bladders that inflate with pressure that push on your torso and push that blood back up in your head when it's trying to drain out. And it'll keep you conscious up to about 9 or 10 Gs, but only a few seconds of that and you pass out. So a Swiss fighter pilot, retired fighter pilot, he said, we need to get a better G-suit. And he asked the biomimicry question, has this problem of high G forces been addressed in the world of biology? And yes, it has, with the dragonfly. The dragonfly can dart around with such quick maneuvers, they estimate it endures at least 30 Gs of force with impunity, whereas our best fighter pilots, 9 or 10, and they're toast. So he said, what is it? Well, it turns out their internal organ system, and especially their cardio system, is entirely encased with fluid. And the fluid dynamics just dampens those G-forces very effectively just by the laws of physics. And so it's better than anything we have ever made. The best one we made is called Combat Edge, and it's very sophisticated, computerized, pneumatic, air pressure vest. All the NATO pilots that tried the Labelle, which means dragonfly in German, so it literally means dragonfly G-suit, all the guy did was say, well, let's copy that. Instead of compressed air, let's use water with a little antifreeze so it won't freeze when it gets cold. And it outperforms everything we have. Much simpler, but more effective. God thought of it first, but his design was better yet because it still gets 30 Gs. We can now pull 10 Gs sustained without passing out because of this new vest. That's unprecedented, but it's still not quite as good as what God gave the dragonfly. It can do 30 Gs. Now, also, we have pilots having to be protected. Their heads and their eyes need to be able to look out, but you need a shield to protect you from perhaps Mach force wind going past, or birds, or small arms fire. So you need a shield that's invisible, a shield that's transparent. But the idea of protecting a pilot with a cockpit canopy that's clear, that's not even something new. God invented that first with an amazing fish called the barrel-eyed fish. We'd been catching these fish in nets since the 1930s, but they seem to rip up so easily that they're always mangled by the time we get them up. And only in recent years have we actually got good underwater photography of what it actually looks like. And it has a clear canopy that it can look out just like the pilots. What does it look like? Well, there it is. Now, the mouth is down here. These are not eyes. Those are nares, the equivalent of underwater nostrils for smelling. The eyes are inside the canopy. These green domes here are the lenses of the eyes, and they sit on barrel-like swivels, so it can swivel looking directly up while it's horizontal. So it swims horizontally looking directly up, and it's looking for the silhouette of a very deadly adversary, jellyfish, that have stinging cells in their tentacles and can do a lot of damage to fish. The neurotoxin paralyzes them. But it apparently is immune to the neurotoxin, but even the physical grinding of those tentacles on the eyes could do physical damage. So God provided it. It's the only fish that we know of that can go after fish that have been caught by jellyfish and steal them from the jellyfish with impunity. One of the reasons it has this crystal canopy to protect its delicate eyes from the stinging tentacles of the jellyfish. God thought of it first. Autopilot's been a great blessing to modern pilots. You can push it in and it keeps your direction, your altitude. If it's tied into GPS, it'll even correct for wind drift that changes over time. But God invented it first with his amazing aeronautical vehicle, the Swift. Recently, tiny tracking devices put on Swifts, tracked 24/7 by computers, proved something we had surmised for a long time, and that is that they stay airborne without ever touching the ground for nearly 7 months straight. They don't have to land because their food is in the air. They eat insects in the air. They come down and skim water off of a lake without landing. They mate in the air. They really don't need to come down to the ground for anything other than to build a nest. If they could build a nest in the air, they'd probably do that, but no, they haven't figured that out yet. But they even have to sleep, obviously. You can't go without sleep for nearly 7 months. They sleep while they're flying, and it's by means of an autopilot. They go up nearly 2 miles, 10,000 feet, fly in a circle over a particular area where their nest is or where there's good hunting. They don't want that circle to be blown off by winds. You can be blown many miles away while you're asleep, not knowing what's going on. So it goes up that high, it shuts down half of its brain so it can rest. The other half engages an autopilot. So while it's flying in this circle, it automatically compensates for the wind. See, when the wind's coming this direction and you're coming on this end of the circle, you have a headwind. That means you got to speed up a little bit or you're going to be pushed back. But on the other end of the circle, it's now a tailwind. Now you got to slow down or you'll be pushed forward. Speed up, slow down, as the wind changes, staying perfectly where they want to be while they're asleep, using an autopilot that's better than anything we have. In fact, Johan Bachmann, a Lund University, Sweden expert on bird navigation, he said, "We have found that swifts have an extraordinary ability to perform orientations in relation to wind. Even the most advanced planes with good navigational instruments would probably be unable to judge the wind drift like this. The remarkable thing is that they do all this while flying through the night and sleeping on the wing at these very high altitudes." God not only created autopilot first, it's still better than anything we have. Now, Henry Ford was one of the first to recognize the virtues of an assembly line. That instead of skilled craftsmen with many skills working on cars until they're done, very expensive, he said, let's just put it on an assembly line where every worker doesn't have to be an expert, he just has to be good at one little job. And as it goes down the line, each person does his one job well, and you get a finished product that's affordable for the first time in history to the average man. But the idea of an assembly line, where you start with a basic product and you add to it until you have a finished product at the end, it's not new. God thought of it first, and he put it in our cells, and it's much like this. It's not manned by workmen, but by programmed automated robots. And the robots he uses in his assembly lines in our cells are more sophisticated and complex than any we have in any automobile factory. They're called enzymes, and they are exceedingly complex. So the Krebs cycle, metabolic cycle, or citric acid cycle is just one of numerous precursor metabolic cycles, but they all work on the assembly line principle. You have a chemical substrate that has to be added to bit by bit. The automatic robots, the enzymes work on it until you get a finished product. That's how metabolism works. It's the assembly line principle. God thought of it first. Finally, we have the Asimo, the walking robot, invented by the Japanese, and it's now rather sophisticated. It used to fall over, bump into things. It was pretty bad. But now they have enough artificial intelligence and cameras and computing power that it can walk around. It won't run into things. If it comes to like a staircase, it recognizes that's a staircase. It'll walk up a staircase, turn around, walk back down, all by itself, no remote control. But long before we perfected this in the 21st century, God made a two-legged walking robot with artificial intelligence, with self-awareness, and if you didn't have it, you could not survive. Because instead of UPS, our cells, to make deliveries of proteins in our cellular cities, it uses walking robots to deliver the protein packages. Walking robots called kinesin. Two of them will attach to a package of proteins if it's too big. It gets directions, almost like GPS directions, from the nucleus of the cell. It can pick up these packages and walk forward or backwards with equal dexterity. And they walk in these three-dimensional highway systems within the cell that are so tiny without electron microscopes you can't even see it. At this magnification, you can't see them. They're only about 15 to 20 nanometers in diameter, nanometer being a billionth of a meter. So we have this little walking robot with a long, thin body, arms up here to lay a hold of the package of proteins. It has two hinges because this thing takes off and walks what would really be more of a run, 100 steps per second, easily. So it takes off, and if it doesn't bend, it'll break. But God put two hinges in the body. At the bottom, we have legs and feet that walk literally left-right like a walking robot. The bottom molecule is called the myosin motor molecule. It's powered by adenosine triphosphate molecules in the cell matrix. And like I say, it takes off 100 steps per second. If I were to go 100 steps per second, I can cover a yard per second because I'm pretty tall. If we made one of these as big and tall as me, and it did 100 steps per second, how fast would it be going? In excess of 200 miles per hour. To give you an idea proportionately of how fast these go, they could go out and compete at the Indianapolis 500 with wheeled race cars, but these are running robots, and they are the delivery system that we depend on. So in the cell, it's amazing. They walk on these microtubule highways. They have situational awareness. If one is coming your direction and you're going the opposite direction, combined speed, if they're as big as us, would be over 400 miles an hour. You better be able to detect them and get out of the way, which they do. They have situational awareness. If we cut one of these tubules, simulating damage to the cell, they don't stop and fall off the edge. They don't go, oh gee, what do I do now? My highway's gone. They have a cellular GPS. They have situational awareness. They know, like the GPS knows, if you take a wrong turn, it still knows where you're going, even if you've never been there. It knows alternate routes. You take different left, right, till you get back on track. You simply recalibrate and take an alternate route to get where you're going. These things will automatically go back to the next intersection and always take the most efficient choice of all the different choices they could take to get them back on target because they have cellular GPS before we ever invented it. God is amazing in what he could do, even at the molecular level, with robots, with AI, and with situational awareness, and much faster than our robots ever dreamed of being. How do the evolutionists respond? Francis Crick, Nobel Prize winner in genetics, he said biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Really? Well, put up or shut up, friend. Just saying it doesn't make it so. You have the facts, the evidence, laws of chemistry, physics, mathematics that shows this work. Where in the history of the world have we ever seen information or complex machines ever arise by totally natural processes with no intelligent involvement? Never. We can prove in any laboratory any day of the year that intelligence produces information, like DNA. That intelligence produces complex machines which operate at the molecular level to read the DNA, understand the blueprint, and build the marvelous structures of the world of biology. Somebody thought of it first, wrote it down, and made robots that can read it and build it. If we saw that in a modern factory, we wouldn't say, oh, gee, look what happened by chance. No matter what you see, it had to have evolved. No, they have a vendetta against God. They don't want to be accountable to that higher intelligence whose evidence we see throughout the universe. In fact, in all these cases, all these are more complex than man ever dreamed of creating, and they all speak of the power of the Creator. As it says in Romans 1:20, ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature and attributes, that is, his eternal power and divinity, have been made intelligible and clearly discernible in and through the things that have been made, his handiworks. We've only looked at some of his marvelous handiworks today. So men are without excuse, altogether without any defense or justification. Well, I do have this available on DVD. There's so much on biomimicry that I have 4 different ones in the series, and you do get a discount if you buy the whole series, but we've run out of time. Thank you so much for your attention.